eMovis Ireland is a leading provider of mobility-based solutions, and they make the complicated easy because they believe in the freedom of going places. And today we're going to meet Orla O'Halloran, who's a consultant with Arup. Orla, thank you for joining us on Going Places today. We're going to talk about women on transport. It's a project you've been firmly involved in for the last number of months, and we're keen to know a lot of the findings that you've found in it. So I guess to start, how long have you been working on it?
Absolutely. So we started back in late September, early October, and since then we've been trying to figure out what the differences are between how men travel and how women travel. So you may not have even thought about it before, or it may never have crossed your mind that you as a man travel differently from me as a woman, and we would tend to think that all of the design of the transport systems that we use, that are public transport or even private solutions, kind of impact everybody equally, or that they're to everybody's equal benefit. And when you start scratching the surface, you realize that's just absolutely not true. So it's been fascinating kind of seeing the real differences and the difficulties that women tend to struggle with more so than men as a general rule. And so some of the major, I suppose, differences are time of travel, mode that people choose, and reasons for travel. And a lot of that is, I think, to do with these traditional roles that we still have in society, whether or not that's social pressure or other forms of biological reasons. That women tend to do most of the unpaid work, most of the household work, most of the childcare. And that means that they're traveling for different reasons, means they're traveling at different times, means that the bus might not be the most comfortable. If you've ever tried getting on a bus with a buggy and a toddler and the weekly shop, you'll realise not particularly accessible, definitely not comfortable, there might not be space for you, and just like schlepping all of that stuff and having to deal with the added pressures of taking care of younger kids, or maybe even travelling with elderly relatives. It's just far more difficult. It's also to do with timing. So if you're in charge of childcare, you're more likely to be dropping kids off earlier. Means that you can't come into work at 7 to beat the traffic. Means that you're confined to the types of timetabling that the public transport systems offer, which might not suit you. If you're a woman, you're more likely to be travelling in the middle of the day rather than at peak hours as well. Services aren't as frequent then, they aren't as reliable. There's all kinds of differences that you wouldn't have thought about.
What about safety?
Safety, I think, is one of the key determinants of mode choice for women, more so than for men. So it might seem pretty intuitive that everybody chooses the mode that makes them feel the most safe, but women's perception of safety is very different from men's. So there are many different studies that will tell you that's a parental instinct, or that's a maternal thing. Self-preservation is, perhaps more deeply ingrained in women than men. I'm not a biologist, can't really explain all of those things. But it would be one of the key reasons that women choose certain modes. So apart from taking more trips and, being responsible for other people and spending more money on traveling with and for dependents, they tend to spend more money on taking safer modes. So more likely to get taxis than take a bus at night time particularly. Far more likely to walk quickly or jog in the evenings to get home quicker. Far more likely to change the route that they take to make sure that they feel safe, like go through better lit parts of town. So yeah, I think the major reason, unfortunately, is that women do tend to be the victims of far more harassment in public places. So it's not just that we have a heightened sense of our own safety, or that we're overreacting. It's the facts are that as a woman, you're far more likely to be the victim of sexual harassment. It's one of the main reasons that something really small, like 2% of women cycle to work. I know they've done a lot of studies recently, and they were on the news here as well, about young women particularly, and schoolgirls don't like cycling in their uniform. They get leered at, they get catcalled, sometimes they get pushed off their bike. It's a miserable experience. And so you're more likely to try and avoid that and consider your safety more important than the price.
Were you shocked by any of the findings in this study, or was it of news to you? Because it certainly is to me to hear a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, so many. So we've looked at the trends kind of globally, which tend to demonstrate that women take public transport, walk and cycle more. They're more structurally dependent on those public forms, but that trend isn't actually reflected here. More women than men drive in Ireland, and they drive much more. So for all of more than 70% of journeys women make in this country are by car, and it's not as much for men. But the most striking thing I found, so looking at a study about women's safety in public in Ireland, is that a full 12% of women don't go back to a place where they've had a experience that made them feel uncomfortable or unsafe, and 1% of women stop going out altogether because they don't feel safe. And that's shocking, and something that we certainly can't accept as just a fact of life. Not like other things maybe that we kind of do accept, like taking a different route, taking a different mode, leaving at a different time, or going with somebody to feel safe. But the fact that you don't leave the house anymore because you don't feel safe is something that I think socially we just can't accept here. Because it stops you from participating in all forms of public life, education, employment, even going to the doctor. If you're afraid to get on the bus, you can.
So what about our transport infrastructure? Does it accommodate women well enough at the moment?
I think to just look at the numbers, the fact that most women drive for most of their journeys would lead you logically to the conclusion that no, it doesn't respond enough to women's needs. But there's one thing responding to the needs and making it accessible and affordable and frequent enough and making it safe enough. But if it's not comfortable, it's not an attractive service, and people still won't opt for it. So if you can afford a car, and we're in the fortunate position here where most people can afford a car, you're going to use the car once you have it. So you need to make the public transport system a viable alternative, and by viable it needs to be as attractive or more attractive than the comfort and the convenience that you get from your own private transport. So more and more people are realising there's hassle involved in owning a car. It's very expensive, parking is difficult,
Traffic is bad.
traffic is shocking.
So there is a will there for people to want to use more public transport.
I think so,
But
yeah.
it has to work, and it has to accommodate many things, not just be efficient, but it has to make women feel safe to use it.
Yeah.
And comfortable to use it. So what changes could we make?
There's a lot that's being done, I suppose, on a European level, which is where we would typically look to see what works and what doesn't in finding responses to these problems. Mostly what we talk about is gender mainstreaming, so it's kind of inserting a gender lens onto problems and doing a kind of a gender impact assessment. So you might think that the introduction of more frequent services is going to impact everybody the same, and that it can actually be that the impact is different for women than it is for men. So that's one of the things that I think would recommend, just to be aware that there are these differences, which is the most striking thing when I talk to anybody about this topic is like, what? It's not different. Like, people aren't different, they don't travel differently, but they do. So it's just being aware of those differences and not saying that one is the norm and one is the aberration. It's understanding that we need to really appreciate what the distinctions are to cater for them. So lighting is one of the factors that makes people feel safe, but it's also one of the things that makes people feel vulnerable.
Okay.
So if you're in a very well-lit place, you might think, oh, this is great. I feel like I can see everybody around me and everyone can see me, and there's safety involved in that. But if you are in a place where there are just incremental spotlights, you might feel like you walk through a period of darkness and then you're suddenly visible to people that you now can't see because they're in the dark. And you walk through that nice shaft of light when you were on display, and then you go in the dark again and you're on display again. So simply saying, oh, we need more lighting is not the solution. It needs to be a little better thought out than that. A lot of the bus stops here, for example, are in kind of rural areas, isolated places, they're just a lollipop stick in the side of the ground. They might be surrounded by shrubbery. They found in some other European nations, if you remove some of that shrubbery, it makes people feel safer because there's not that stranger danger, like element of surprise, someone's going to jump out of nowhere. You know, all of these are very unlikely to happen, but it's the perception of safety that's going to really dictate how people move. And if you're not going to feel safe, irrespective of the presence or otherwise of real danger, you're just not going to take the bus if the bus is your mode. So small things like that can really make a huge difference. Typically, people find the presence of a conductor or some kind of security staff much more reassuring than a technological solution like CCTV. Because it's all very well for you to catch the person, I was going to say the guy, it's usually a man after the fact, but that's called comfort, you know, when you'd rather be able to prevent the discomfort or whatever might be the cause of your feeling of insecurity.
In the other aspects, in terms of, say, women's lifestyle, mothers with young children needing to get to schools, getting to do shopping, and we talk about the buses maybe not being the most suitable and hence the need for a car. Is there solutions to that area where we can encourage more public transport?
Yeah, so I think it's not just women who experience these issues with access and difficulties getting on and feelings of safety. I mean, if you make these improvements for women, people who use wheelchairs are going to experience those benefits too, and children. It's one of the main things that people complain about, like to do with traffic, particularly in the mornings. It's all the kids being dropped to school because, you know, children are not considered as safe to go out on their own as adults. So of course they're being dropped off, and maybe they're being dropped off because their parents don't want them taking the bus on their own. Maybe they're being dropped off because it's on the way to wherever their parents are going. But either way, people tend to project their own feelings of either lack of safety or the bus not being comfortable onto their children, and by not letting them use those services, it just prolongs that whole feeling like, well, I take the bus until such a time as I can afford not to have to. So it's really seen as like you know, penalty or some kind of disadvantage to have to take public transport, as opposed to the norm and the fastest or the most convenient way to get around, which is what it should be. So for children, I think, gosh, what could we do? I mean, there are lots of localized solutions that I think are already being put in place, and like walking trains or biking trains, where one parent in the community will lead all of the kids in the locality to a school, for example, on foot or on a bike. It just takes so much more willingness on the part of people, and, you know, whether we care to cast judgment or not, like, people are time poor, they're tired from like busy lives, and you can't just expect all of these things to grow organically or naturally. I think we need to do more to push them along and to facilitate them.
And that is a responsibility of the transport industry en masse to
I think so.
improve the
Like to
situation.
think so, yeah. Because the fact of the matter is it might not happen on its own.
Okay, we've discussed the topic of mobility as a service before on this podcast. What's your view on it and where we are? Are we lacking in it in areas of it that we need to improve?
Yeah, I think if you were to take the strict sense of the term and the definition, we don't really have that here at all. We have a degree of integration of transport. We have Leap Card, which of course can use for numerous different services now, but not being too technical about it, it's just hosting different accounts on the one card. It's not one inclusive account in and of itself. In the other places where, you know, there is a service that's similar to mobility as a service, they have far more micro-mobility options than we do as well. That will be electric bikes or electric scooters, more car sharing. I know that's an attitudinal thing as well. People don't really like to share here. I think everyone likes to have their own car. But, you know, ride-hailing, hailing even the likes of Uber and how it functions in other jurisdictions. You know, that's kind of lacking, because access to a car is really crucial to the viability of that service. Because I think, being realistic, you can't compare to the level of service that a car gives by replacing it with just buses or bus and metro. It's always nearly going to take a bit longer. You can get it cheaper, but you sacrifice the time for that. So there's a lot of, I think, interest in introducing the concept here and in promoting more sustainable means of travel that wouldn't rely on the car so much, because we're very car dependent here. But we're not quite there yet.
And mobility as a service, particularly in rural areas, is it practical? Would it work, given that local transport companies, some of whom do struggle to make a profit?
They do say that there is potential for this to be the solution to rural mobility problems. I think so, because the rural population is so large here. I mean, if you go by what the CSO says, it's over a third of the population lives in rural areas. That's outside 1,500 inhabitants. 1,500 is a small number of inhabitants as well. And realistically speaking, it's going to be a loss-making venture to try and provide the same frequency of services to the same number of destinations to service everybody's needs through public transport. We don't even currently do that or provide that level of service in Dublin or in any of the cities in this country. So you can't purport to be able to do that in a place with such a low density. A critical mass of people signing up to these services is kind of what is required. So I think there's potential to have a service that would be similar to mass, but I think we need to understand that the backbone of that service can't be public transport as we envisage it in cities. And urban solutions can't really just be transposed into rural areas where they're not appropriate. But there are plenty of things that we could do to help people move between rural areas and between cities and small towns much easier. And I think one of the best examples is the Swiss Post service that runs kind of in Switzerland and in some of the other Alpine nations. So it's just basically moving people around with the postman. So the postman has to go, postperson, to every single house in a country at some point during the day. Has to touch all of the different address points, basically. So when you've got parcels, why don't you just have a few people as well? And they run this service quite efficiently and they have been for the last 20 years, really, dropping people in the post van. What do you know?
What do you know? I'm paused there because I was like, that's so simple. So the postman is the taxi man, is the bus driver, is the...
Basically, he's Jack and Jill of all trades.
Yeah.
Yeah, why not?
And it's successful and it works?
It does, yeah, for lots of those harder to reach areas where, the postal service, there's an obligation.
Yeah, somebody's
to
going
have
there,
that,
so you might as well go with them.
Exactly. So all you need is the technology to facilitate that. So some platform that can connect the driver with the passenger. And it also gives you a feeling of security too, that it's like when you order a taxi now through the Free Now app, you know who's coming for you. There's a trail of who it was, where they collected you, what time, and where they brought you. So if you can know in advance when there's going to be certain types of deliveries to certain areas, you can just say, can I get a lift, basically.
I like the innovation, that's a good idea. The increase, the numbers that have increased and the demand for public transport in Ireland, and particularly in Dublin, is on the rise rapidly over the last number of years. What changes can we make to ease the pressures on particular types of public transport, maybe to try and spread it out a bit more?
Yeah, I think there's so many different solutions that require so many different actors in the answer to this question. So with schools and childcare in general, there's going to be very little movement on start times for those jobs. Basically, schools aren't suddenly going to begin earlier or later. So there's a certain amount of the peak traffic that probably can't be shifted. But a lot of the more flexible work, not shift work, or you don't work in a shop or something like that, has potential for teleworking, for you to stagger start times, to allow flexibility for people to not all have to travel at the same time. The difficulty with that is that you just spread out your peak hour, or your peak hours, which I think they talk about in London and Sydney and other big cities, where peak time in the morning is now from 6:30 till 10:30, or till 11 o'clock in the morning. So there isn't really a time anymore that you can avoid the traffic. So that's one. Secondly, I think if it was demand for taxis, for example, I mean, we're involved in a study with Free Now at the moment to do with redistributing some of the demand that they experience at their peak times as well, and how you could maybe find ways to encourage people to travel at different times. So yesterday morning on the radio, there was somebody talking about the idea of staggering closing times of pubs. That would mean, it's a long time since I was kicked out of a pub when it closed, but that would mean that not everyone's standing out on the street corner trying to hail a taxi at the same time, whatever it is, 2 in the morning. If you could take different regions around a city or different localities and say, here the law says, or the licensing laws is that everything closes at 12:30 and then 1 and 2, etc. You could distribute the demand a little more evenly so that we could respond to it better, and that there wouldn't be a mad rush for the last bus. Or ways that maybe we could use taxi services to bring people to night buses, or that if they got the night bus and then they didn't feel safe having to walk home or do the last mile of their journey on their own, that you could source, you know, a little minibus or something to bring people from the end of the bus line to where they need to actually end up. And there's a way to integrate better with taxis, I think, and public transport, integrate the two of those for a better distribution of the demand, and then being able to meet it in a more safe, convenient way.
I have 2 final questions for you.
Okay.
The first one is, I want you to project 5 years from now, and what do you think changes will have been made to the transport industry in Ireland, and if that's maybe particularly with a view to women on transport or not, what do you think real changes we'll see in 5 years?
What will have changed? I'm really hoping that we're going to see a big attitude shift towards driving. I'm really hoping that the reliance on everyone having their own car and needing it to drive everywhere is going to change. I really hope that's going to reduce. So my kind of background is environmental and, you know, sustainability. And you can say, well, if we all drive electric cars, then we won't have this air quality issue, we won't have a carbon emissions issue, but we'll still have a congestion issue. And we will still have a dependence on an unsustainable asset, basically. So I would love for people to get out of the Margaret Thatcher mentality of, like, if you're over 25 and you still take public transport, you've failed in life. You know, she's responsible for apparently popularizing this view that if you're a grown-up, you drive. And I think because a car is still a status symbol here, and it's, well, not just here, and it's still the symbol of freedom, that really needs to become, you know, that needs to shift onto something else. You know, freedom needs to be, I don't have to own any of these big expensive chunks of metal. I can go out of my house wherever I want, whenever I want, in a way that isn't damaging to the environment to the same extent as it would be if I drove everywhere. I'm really hoping that we'll see that shift, not just because it's such a pain to drive everywhere because of traffic and the expense and everything, but because more and more we're understanding that we need to really do something urgent to stop a massive climate breakdown. And this is one of the things that everybody needs to do on an individual basis, and there is an alternative, so it's not like it's impossible.
Okay, and the final question is this. If you could change one thing right now with the click of your fingers to do with transport in Ireland, what would it be? Anything at all?
Nothing happened.
Hang on, someone wake up the genie in the lamp. We'll rub it again.
God. Something to change immediately right now. My ultimate transport wish. I think it would be that you didn't have to make trade-offs between the time you want to leave and the price that you want to pay. And that you didn't have to sacrifice so much of your free time on such an essential part of your day, which is getting where you need to go. And it's not a luxury anymore to be able to travel. It's a definite necessity. And it would make life so much easier for so many people if you could just go where you need to go, when you need to go, without having to drive.
So on your terms and the way you want to do it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Orla, thanks so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you
It's
for
been
having
really
me.
interesting. Thank you so much.